Hello everybody and welcome along to a brand new video today where of course we have the Doctor Who Series 11 soundtrack release, but is it any good? So yes, on last Friday we got the release of the Series 11 soundtrack. As you can see here, I've got the lovely digipack version. We've got, the 2 discs and a little booklet inside as well, and it's rather lovely. With 2.5 hours of music or so, I believe, on the soundtrack, covering all 10 episodes plus the special from Series 11, and of course released just a few days, literally, after the last episode aired, Resolution. It's only 10 days from Resolution airing to the release, which is pretty fantastic. And of course, it's a new composer for Doctor Who this year with Segun Akinola, or last year now, composing for this series for the first time, it not being Murray Gold for the first time in the whole of New Who. He's composed every single episode up until Series 11. And listening to this soundtrack, you straight away get a feel that this is a very different sort of style of music to what we got used to in the Murray Gold era. Of course, we all know this because you've heard it in the episodes already, but when you listen to it isolated, you really do kind of get even more of that sense of it being much more focused on being atmospheric and building the mood that you're seeing on screen, rather than being a lot of it is not that kind of heavy bombastic leading the scene. You're really listening to the music sort of in that moment watching the episode. It's more meant to kind of complement everything else in the background along with the other sort of sound design and everything like that. And yeah, it is very noticeable within this soundtrack that a lot of it is more atmospheric. Just compared to sort of previous soundtracks, it definitely feels a lot more tracks that have just kind of, that are very, very long suites of music that are maybe 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 minutes long. And a lot of them kind of have very sort of repetitive pulsating beats running underneath for maybe 2 minutes consecutively, with pretty much the same sort of notes playing in just a sort of building, pulsating way, which of course fits lovely in the episode and really builds up the excitement and the tension and whatever. But I think in the soundtrack it can sometimes drag a little bit, and there are a few tracks where you kind of think, why did you put that one on there? Why did you make it that long? It feels like this bit's a bit pointless when it's sort of 2 minutes of just the same sort of couple of notes that are just repeating. It seems a little bit unnecessary when you've only got a certain amount of space to play with. But there are still a lot of very, very good pieces of music on this soundtrack. So right from the off, within the first episode and the first few tracks of the soundtrack, from The Woman Who Fell to Earth, the tracks like The Doctor and Sonic Screwdriver, those sort of versions of the 13th Doctor's theme, particularly The Doctor, the actual moment, is such a kind of beautiful, triumphant, epic piece of music that really fits, I think, Jodie's Doctor fantastically, and also fits really nicely sort of into a soundtrack. Listening to it isolated, it's definitely one of the strongest pieces of music on this soundtrack, and really just sort of with the female vocals that they've got included on there as well, just I really do think just fits Jodie's Doctor perfectly. But is also a lovely piece of music to listen to, and is also the one that is pulled out most throughout the rest of this soundtrack in terms of hearing variations of it and hints at it and things like that. And so it's kind of quite fun to listen through to this soundtrack and just try and spot each of the different variations of 13's theme, because there's probably a good 7, 8, 9 different versions of it that are heard throughout different tracks on this 41 track soundtrack. So I think it's one of the strongest, most notable pieces of music from the series. It's very much, if you're going to know any music from this series, it will be the 13th Doctor's theme that we really hear in all its glory for the first time as she stood up on top of the crane opposite Tim Shaw, telling the world that she is the Doctor, telling us that she's the Doctor for the first time. That music playing in the background is the music we hear in this particular track called The Doctor. And I think it's one of the strongest pieces of music that we hear throughout the Series 11 soundtrack. As we skip through there, the Ghost Monument's got some nice, more atmospheric stuff in to a large degree, whereas I think there is some atmospheric stuff on The One Who Fell to Earth, but there's also those quite kind of more exciting, iconic themes of the Sonic Screwdriver scene and for the Doctor's sort of big moment theme. There's a little bit more going on in those, whereas we get to sort of the Ghost Monument, and there are some sort of more varied moments. We've got music from the scene where Ryan goes out with his gun to try and shoot all the robots off, and that sort of heavy electric guitars that suddenly start playing. There is a bit of variation in that regard from what they pulled out of there. And there's also the really, really nice track at the end of the episode when we discover the TARDIS for the first time. Another one of the highlights of the soundtrack for me, definitely, as it's just kind of again interweaves 13's theme into this piece of music, just kind of. And a piece of music that's just kind of showing us this brand new TARDIS, this sort of excitement, the thrill of seeing this magnificent machine for the first time, again, all brand new, and then building to a sort of a very exciting climax in that piece of music as well to close out the episode. So that's definitely another highlight from this soundtrack. For whatever reason, we then skip to Arrakis in the UK, missing out Rosa, which doesn't come in until the second disc of this soundtrack. And this, in Arrakis in the UK, there's only 2 or 3 tracks from there, one of them being, again, the final sort of piece of music from the episode when the TARDIS crew finally say, yes, we want to come travelling with you. And that's quite nice, again, bringing in 13's theme. There's a lot of that throughout this sort of soundtrack, like we kind of got with the Series 5 soundtrack and I Am the Doctor, or the Series 8 soundtrack and A Good Man. Sort of, it always seems in the new Doctor's first series, there's very much a lot of different versions of their theme that are interweaved throughout the soundtrack, both in the episodes and what ends up coming out onto the soundtrack. And again, that's, yeah, as I say, present in Arrakis in the UK. Alongside some nice, again, more atmospheric pieces of music, this is where you sort of very much get the vibe of the more just atmospheric stuff there. Interestingly, there's not very much of the sort of theme of the spiders almost, that quite sort of interesting sort of just set of notes that played almost like a little sort of sting every time one of the giant spiders appeared in the episode. There's only, I think, 1 or 2 moments of that throughout kind of 10 minutes or so of music from that episode, which slightly surprised me given it was kind of the iconic theme, at least, even if it's only more of a sting. It was still one of the most iconic ones from that particular episode. Then actually one of my highlights of the soundtrack is the music from the Saranga Conundrum. Of course, the episode got slated, and I agree it's not a particularly good episode, but the soundtrack itself, which I thought at the time as well, is really, really sort of fantastic. It's really, really interesting. It's very much, as Sagan talks about in the booklet, sort of in his notes for each of the sort of episode tracks, about this episode was very much a sort of in this medical hospital. It had a very 80s vibe to it in terms of the feel. It almost felt like an 80s Doctor Who episode. I think a lot of those sort of on a white spaceship medical sort of cruiser type thing, it just seemed to fit quite nicely with an 80s feel, and that's very much brought out in the music, which is very sort of heavy pulsating synthesized music throughout these sort of 2 7 or 8 minute suites of music that we've got on this particular soundtrack. There's the nice kind of sting for the pating, which we get a couple of times, I think, in the second track, Recess 1, because the first track, called Saranga, is from the sort of early part of the episode. All these tracks, I should say, are just sort of single sections of music that have been pulled out of the episodes, because a lot of the episodes didn't have such defined singular pieces of music. It was much more one track would just flow into the next one and there's not a kind of break. So there was a lot more music in some of these episodes because they just kept on flowing one into another. So it's meant that I think Segans had to pull out more kind of suites of music rather than individual tracks, and that's very much seen in these 2 tracks from the Saranga Conundrum, where this, yeah, as I say, this first track is from when the sort of Pating first arrives on the ship, or when he kills, I can't even remember what the guy's name is, but that bloke medical dude, I really have no idea what his name was, but when he died, there's that sort of suite of music that's playing underneath that gets quite intense and exciting. And also the piece of music from the very end of the episode as well, when the Pating's sort of sent away, they manage to save the medical ship as well, and that again just sort of building intense pulsating piece of music that really sounds really good in the episode, but I think does actually sort of work on the soundtrack, whereas some of the pieces of music that are more atmospheric in style, like this is to a degree, do become a little bit too repetitive and not sort of intense and exciting enough. Whereas I find both of these pieces of music really just keep up the energy and the intensity and really building to a lovely climax, and just kind of giving that kind of 80s vibes to it as well, just adds a little bit something different to it. And so I think are very much some of my highlights of this soundtrack, which seems kind of weird because it's one of the most worst episodes of the series, but music-wise, it's one of the best. Following on from that, we have a couple of tracks from Kablam. These ones, unfortunately, are, in my opinion, a little bit of a disappointment because they are very kind of purely atmospheric. There is not a lot else going on. This is almost for me, I think, the most noticeable sort of example of the very repetitive nature of some of these tracks, where it does feel like the same notes are just repeating throughout and a lot. And it works good in the episode. That's the idea behind it, and it fits the episode nicely. But I find in the soundtrack itself, it doesn't really do that much for me, apart from the sort of kablam sting that you get every time a kind of kablam box pops into the scene or something like that, or on the robots. It's quite a nice, interesting little sort of sci-fi sting, I think would be the best way of describing it. But as a pure sort of full couple of, I think it's an 8-minute and a 5-minute track from Kablam, they aren't the most exciting tracks from the soundtrack, I don't think. Following on from that, we have rather randomly, we skip to the finale and go for the Battle of Ranskorav Kolos. I don't really understand the ordering of the sort of tracks or the episodes within the soundtrack. They've grouped the episodes together, but I don't really know why episodes 1, 2, 4, 5, 7 and 10 are on the first disc, and then it's 3, 6, 7, 9 and the special are on the other disc. I don't really know. That's a bit random, but that's what they decided to do. And yeah, the Battle of Ranskorav Kolos, again, some of it's a little bit more sort of instrumental, atmospheric, not too much happening with it. But the final track from this episode, Keep the Faith, is a very, very exciting, intense, energetic piece of music, the sort of where we have the climax of the episode when the Ucks are sort of fighting back against Tim Shaw when Tim Shaw's destroyed. They're trying to save the Earth from being blown up and everything like that. That sort of epic, exciting piece of music that plays in that scene is really brought out fantastically in this soundtrack. It sort of brings in a version of 13's theme with some even more intense vocals added onto it as well, just to kind of boost the excitement of that moment. And it really just feels like a proper epic conclusion to the first disc of this soundtrack. And then bringing in that nice sort of piece of music right at the very end of the episode where the Doctor says we're going off on adventures and whatnot, and it closes out to the sort of end credits. It's just that sort of lovely, nice building up piece of music to sort of conclude that first disc. So I think that's another one of the very, very highlights of this soundtrack. On disc 2, we start off with, well, first off a specially composed track called 13, which you probably would have heard before anyway, because it was released as a single a few weeks ago to kind of promote the soundtrack. This is a piece of music that wasn't actually used in Series 11, it was just especially composed for this soundtrack. It's good, but I'm not really fussed about it because it wasn't actually in the episodes, and I prefer the episodic version of 13's theme than this attempt at it. So it's nice, but it's not really what I'm bothered about. But once we get past that first track, we then look at the historical stories. Maybe that's why they put them together like they did, because then we have the 3 historical stories music back to back with Rosa, Demons of the Punjab and the Witchfinders. And Rosa is good, what is there. I know, as a few other people have said, there does feel like there's a few bits of music lacking from this soundtrack. We still do get maybe, I think, around 15 minutes or so of music from Rosa, so I wouldn't say it's massively underserved, but there probably is a few pieces that we would have liked to have heard missing from this particular episode. But the stuff we do have there very much brings out a sort of slightly different vibe to a lot of the soundtrack, where a lot of this feels a lot more sort of heavy, in-your-face music. It's more Murray Gold-esque. We talked about it at the time, and it comes out again in this soundtrack that it just feels sort of more, there's more going on. It feels more like it's meant to lead the scenes that we're seeing on screen, as opposed to the more atmospheric style from a lot of the episodes that Segun's composed. So that's a kind of a nice change. I really like Rosa Parks' sort of theme that we get sort of interweaved through a few of these tracks for the Rosa episode, and it just kind of has a really nice vibe. I think it fits the episode really well, and also comes off quite nicely on the soundtrack. Then for me, one of the highlights of the soundtrack is all the piece of music from Demons of the Punjab, bringing out that it's the most kind of different music to anything else that you hear on this soundtrack. The very sort of Punjabi style music that, of course, perfectly fits this episode. But I think because it sounds so different to everything else, I think that just almost makes it more interesting and more enjoyable, because it is just a change to the more atmospheric synthy style music that a lot of this soundtrack sort of compiles of. Whereas it goes completely different with this Punjabi style music, and it gets quite, because I can quite sort of visually picture where the music fits into this with this episode. The final track, called I Love You Nanny, is the sort of 8 minutes leading up to the very end of the episode, where we see, I can't remember the dude's name, but Umbreen, the man that Umbreen was going to marry, him getting killed, and the music that sort of plays underneath that, you really feel the kind of dramatic, sort of heartbreaking moment when he does get killed. You really feel that in the music, because it is such a kind of intense piece of music, but also quite an emotive piece of music, I think. And that kind of fits with all of the Demons of the Punjab tracks, it just feels kind of quite sort of eerie, I think, with those male sort of choral vocals that are interweaved throughout in this sort of Punjabi style, weaved throughout these particular tracks. I think it works really, really effectively. And of course, having the end credits version there, I'm really, really pleased that we got that. The sort of clean end credits from that particular episode, which are interweaved into a Punjabi style Doctor Who theme, which sounds fantastic. It really fits the episode and the atmosphere of it perfectly. The only thing I'm slightly disappointed about is that in the episode itself, the track that's called on this soundtrack, I Love You Nanny, leads straight into the end credits. It's sort of one track fades into another, whereas on this soundtrack the 2 tracks are cut apart with a fade off on one and a fade up on the other. And because I'm so used to what it sounds like on the episode, it just kind of feels a little bit of a rough transition, when one track that's meant to flow straight into the next one just kind of fades down rather awkwardly, and then suddenly it goes boom, we're into the end credits bit with a male vocal hit straight away. It just was a little bit abrasive, I think, and not the kind of best edit they could have done. I think they would have been better off just keeping that track sort of stuck to the end of the previous one, even though obviously they wanted to sell it sort of as that's a significant piece, that's the end credits music. It's more interesting to keep it separate so it's one individual track, but I think it would have been better to keep it combined with the previous track. And then coming towards the end of the soundtrack, we have the Witchfinders, which has some really nice music actually from it. The King James track, which features the sort of theme for King James when he first sort of pops onto scene, has a very kind of royal, sort of classic royal feel to it. It sort of feels like we are seeing a king here. It's very, very important, but almost slightly comedic, I think, because King James is meant to be such a comedic character in this episode. I think it almost sort of tickles into that vibe of comedy over the kind of royal aspect of it that it's obviously trying to bring out, but because they kind of know that he's a comedic character, that's almost seeping through at times as well, I find. So it's a really kind of sort of got a lot of layers to it, that piece of music, and I think works really effectively both on screen and in the soundtrack. Then coming to It Takes You Away, which has 2 tracks, Reverse the Polarity and Made a New Friend. This is another episode which unfortunately is lacking a bit of music. It's very disappointing to see that the piece of music from when the Doctor sees the frog, I know it's a controversial scene, but when the Doctor sees the frog, or the solid track as it should properly be known, that music is non-existent on this soundtrack, whereas both the piece of music either side of that are both on there, which is kind of weird, really, when that was one of the sort of iconic scenes of the series, really, and had quite a good soundtrack to it as well. So for them to not bother to put it on there was a little bit strange. But the stuff they put on there was good. The Reverse the Polarity track really absolutely builds up. It kind of goes up and down a bit, because it's the scene when the Doctor's trying to convince all the people to go back into the normal universe and sort of struggling to get them to do that and whatnot. So it keeps kind of going up as they're about to and then bringing it back down again. And it's a very sort of meandering piece of music in that regard, but then building to the climax with 13's theme getting extremely intense, one of the most intense sort of musical moments of the series, I think, building to the conclusion of this track. So it's another one of my absolute highlights of the whole soundtrack. That final minute of Reverse the Polarity, where it builds into the most intense variation of 13's theme that we've had so far. And then finally we get the soundtrack to Resolution. We get 2 tracks from that called Rebuilt and Me and My Mates. That's essentially the last 20 minutes or so of music from Resolution. This is a fantastic one. I really, really enjoy both of these tracks. They don't feel atmospheric. They feel like in a lot of it there's a lot going on. Of course, we have that kind of really rising moment, that sort of stinging moment when the Dalek appears on screen for the first time. That's really well realised in the music on the soundtrack. And it just kind of has such a variation from the kind of electric guitars to then more synthy atmospheric-y stuff, then going really heavy on the orchestra as well. There's just such variety in both of these tracks, and again the final track, Me and My Mates, really just builds to a conclusion as we see again the final scene of Resolution, as we're kind of finishing off this sort of series of Doctor Who properly. That kind of rising moment of music with 13's theme interweaved into it again. As I say, there's a lot of versions of it throughout this soundtrack, and definitely the highlights of it, and Me and My Mates just kind of completes that right at the end with a 10 minutes and 20-second suite. It's one of the longest tracks we've ever had on a Doctor Who soundtrack, and it is fantastic, really. And of course you've got the opening theme and the end credits as well. Unfortunately no middle 8, there's not sort of a version with that in, that I know is always asked for a lot by fans, and they decided not to do that once again, which is a little bit of a shame, but so be it. That's just what we have to sort of cope with. But it does also seem a little bit weird that they've decided to split them up and have one at the start, one at the end, rather than just a suite which combines both. But I guess they just wanted to kind of bookend the soundtrack by having the opening at the start and the end at the end, which does make sense. And so yes, overall I did thoroughly enjoy this soundtrack. I thought it was a very kind of nice flowing soundtrack. It doesn't feel like there's a lot of tracks that don't need to be on there. As I said, there's a few moments where there's some sort of atmospheric stuff that's a little bit less exciting, shall we say, but it doesn't feel like, whereas as much as I think a lot of the Marigold soundtracks are good and probably have more highlights, there's also some tracks where you're just kind of like, why did they bother putting that on there? It's just a silly piece of comedy music that isn't really enjoyable or even worth putting in. When I don't feel like there's much of that at all in this soundtrack, which I think is really, really nice. So it's one that you could just sit down and listen to it all through, and I think it sounds really, really effective. Yes, it is a different style, and I know some people haven't liked that style so much because it is just less kind of, almost less noticeable. There's less iconic themes interweaved into this soundtrack and having iconic tracks that we've had throughout all the previous Murray Gold soundtracks, and so I can completely understand that viewpoint, and that's fair enough. And I probably do still prefer the Murray Gold style of music for Doctor Who than I do the second Akinola, but I definitely don't think his music is bad. I think the 13's theme is definitely the highlight, and that being interweaved throughout. Most tracks are well served, but there are a couple of moments where, sort of a couple of episodes, It Takes You Away and Rosa in particular, where it feels like there are some sort of significant tracks missing from the soundtrack, which is a little bit of a shame. And maybe if they'd released it a little bit after the series, a bit more after the series, there would have been an opportunity to sort of garner fan opinion on what's popular and what's not from the episodes to be able to then create the perfect soundtrack. But I guess they decided they didn't want to do that. So yes, overall a solidly enjoyable soundtrack, very pleased to have it nice and quickly, and yes, just an overall very enjoyable listen. But what about you guys? Have you heard it yet? If you have, do let me know down in the comments below what you thought about it. What are your favourite tracks from the new soundtrack as well? Do you love 13's theme, or are you not so much of a fan? What do you think of it in comparison to Murray Gold music as well? I'd just love to hear your guys' thoughts on the Series 11 soundtrack. Now, I know a lot of people have been asking about the Series 10 soundtrack and where that's at. I'm going to be doing a video next week trying to explain the situation and why we haven't got it yet, when we might have it. So look out for that next week, where I'll give you my full sort of opinion on what's going on with that. But that's just about it from this video, guys. I hope you have enjoyed it, and do remember to hit that like button if you did, subscribe if you're new here, and I'll see you again very soon for another one. Goodbye!